Well, it's been a long journey, but we are finally here at the end of Fazbear Frights. If we're ignoring Felix the Shark, man, I have to find some way to get that book one of these days. Uh, I'll have to find it on eBay or something. Uh, yeah, Fine Player 2. So far, it's actually been my favorite story in the book, and we'll see if it continues to be so. I feel like this series has kind of fallen off in the last few books, but you know what? This is looking to be pretty good and a pretty good finale, and the Stitch Wraith was also really good. So I think this could be a good send off to the series, apart from Felix the Shark and the graphic novels and Tales from the Peachplex and everything else that comes out, which I'm sure there'll be so much more. But yeah, let's get to the final part. Here we go. So where we left off, Amy had confronted this. I think his name is Edward or something. Edward, maybe. And basically, he did not admit to killing Mary Jo. He says that he was getting his own daughter there, and he got arrested because he didn't have custody of his daughter. And now she's kind of stuck in his house, and she kind of assaulted him, or he assaulted her, or whatever. And now she's trying to escape because he's calling the police on her. So I guess we'll see where this goes. Alright. The bush did break her fall, but it also scraped her arms and hands. It hurt, but Amy kept her teeth clamped together. Breathing hard, she glanced up at the window to be sure Tucker wasn't coming after her, and then she tore around to the front of his mobile home. As she did, she heard a siren in the distance. She ran faster. Jumping into her car, Amy had the engine started when she saw, in her rearview mirror, Tucker barreling out of his mobile home. She quickly put the car into gear, and it shot down his bumpy dirt driveway. Amy passed a police cruiser just a few hundred yards after she got back onto the road. She made sure she drove sedately, and looked innocent as it went past. Once it did, she sped up. Her hands and arms stinging from the scratches the bush gave her, her hip and head sore from being tossed into the bathroom, Amy was literally shaking. She felt beat up and freaked out. Whether she was shaking in pain, anger, or relief, she didn't know. She made herself take long, even breaths as she kept glancing in her rearview mirror to be sure no one was pursuing her. Amy ground her teeth. She slapped her hand on the steering wheel, not in celebration this time. She fisted her hand and pounded on the steering wheel in frustration. How had this gotten so turned around? Tucker was the criminal, not her. Tucker was more than likely giving the police Amy's description and a description of her car right now. She should probably get out of town. The thick gray clouds that had been hovering so low all morning finally gave up trying to hang on to their moisture. Fat raindrops smacked at Amy's windshield. But was that it? Would she never find out what happened to Mary Jo? Amy realized she was feeling more beat up and freaked out. She was devastated. What were you expecting, she asked. Had she thought Tucker would admit to taking Mary Jo and tell her he would have taken Mary Jo no matter what Amy had done? Had she thought she was going to get a big old "it wasn't your fault" speech from the man? She realized she wasn't sure what she expected from conversation with Emmett, but now she was left with even more questions than she'd lived with for 10 years. If he wouldn't admit to what he did, how was she going to find out what had happened to Mary Jo? Seriously, how do I prove what he did? Amy asked the heavier rain, now streaking across the glass in front of her. Should she just leave? Should she just do what Greta was always saying, go into therapy, learn to forgive herself, and forget about Mary Jo? Amy shook her head. She couldn't do that. Any of it. She didn't want to go into therapy. She didn't want to leave without finding out something. And she couldn't forget Mary Jo. Ever. Mary Jo deserved to be remembered. So what other options did she have? Amy looked past the rain to the town ahead. The answers to her questions had to be here someplace. The rain picked up even more. Amy reached out and turned up the speed of her windshield wipers. The swish-thunk rhythm of their swipes across the glass was strangely comforting. I can do this, she said, pressing harder on the accelerator and concentrating on her slow breathing. She was going to figure out once and for all what happened to Mary Jo. And she knew just where to go next. She was going to do what all detectives did, return to the scene of the crime. Amy kept breathing slowly and deeply until she pulled into Freddy's crowded parking lot. Oh boy, we're going back to Freddy's. One final time, perhaps. Hang on a second. Amy frowned at the sprawling two-story building at the edge of the lot. It was in the right place, but that was about it. This wasn't Freddy's. Amy glared at the massive building that appeared to have eaten Freddy's, and as she looked at it, she realized it was Freddy's. It was just an abominable version of Freddy's. The old pizzeria had been built over and around, bloating it into what looked like a kitschy tourist trap. With 2 stories instead of Freddy's as one, this restaurant looked to be entirely new. It was rustic in appearance, but that was a facade. Its foul, old-timey siding looked too pristine and clean to have been around for long. Amy ducked her head to look out and up through her windshield at a big wood sign supported by a couple of tall, thick logs. Burned into the blonde wood, black letters spelled out the name of the restaurant now occupying Freddy's old building. Flo's Fabulous Eatery. Under the sign, a smaller dark green sign with white lettering read, "Home of the Leaning Tower of Pancakes. Come on in and sit a spell." A car engine revved nearby, and Amy was jolted back to the present. She sank low in her seat. Had the cops found her? Behind her, a big black truck backed into the nearby parking slot. She blew out her pent-up air, slid forward in her seat, and checked her appearance in the mirror on her visor. Amazingly, she didn't look like she'd just been in a confrontation. Her hair was mussed, but it went back into place when she finger-combed it. Her face looked fine, the backs of her hands were scratched, and there was a little blood on the sleeve of her torn sweater, but it wasn't all that noticeable. She'd pass inspection if no one looked at her closely. Amy flipped up her visor. She'd better get inside and look around before she was spotted. Checking over her shoulder for the 3rd time since she left the car, Amy stepped into the lobby of Flo's Fabulous Eatery. It was just afternoon, which explained why the clatter of utensils and buzz of conversation coming from the restaurant's dining room was loud. Amy nearly jumped out of her shoes when she was greeted by an effervescent woman about her own age. "Welcome to Flo's Fabulous Eatery," the woman said. "Did you bring your hunger with you?" Amy tensed, and then forgetting her predicament for a second, she blinked and stared at the woman who'd spoken to her. The woman laughed. "This must be your first time here. I know, I look ridiculous. Flo isn't a person, she's a cow." She pointed. Amy turned and widened her eyes at a life-size sculpture of a Holstein cow. It was right inside the restaurant doorway, but Amy had missed it because she'd been so focused on what she was here for. Amy turned to the hostess and gestured at the black and white cow costume the woman wore. She focused on keeping her tone light and innocent. She was just a diner here for a meal. She was not a fugitive investigating its appearance. "Well," she read the woman's name tag, "Kim, you make Holstein look good." Kim, olive-skinned with big brown eyes and wavy brown hair, did actually look kind of cute in the costume. It helped that she had a dimpled smile. She wasn't taking herself too seriously. "Thanks," she said. "You're very nice." She picked up a menu and turned toward the dining room. Amy hesitated, looking around to check if anyone was observing her. No one was. She glanced at the decor. Amy had hoped that once she was inside the restaurant she would see something familiar, but nothing was as she remembered it. Freddy's lobby had been large, but mostly empty, just lined with red benches to sit on when you had to wait for a table. An archway had separated the lobby from the huge dining room. From that archway, you could see the stage and the animatronics. Flo's lobby was even bigger than Freddy's had been, and it was filled with furniture, set up to look like a sitting room in a 19th century home. It held at least a dozen overstuffed settees, ottomans, and chairs. Instead of an archway leading into the dining room beyond, what looked like the gates to a pasture separated the waiting room from the eating area. Even from here, through the slats of the gates, Amy could see that the dining room was totally different than it had been when the building had been a Freddy's. For one thing, the stage where the animatronics used to perform, which should have been on the far side of the dining room, was gone. For another thing, the black and white tile floor had been replaced with a bright green linoleum floor. She thought that was weird. The black and white floor would have fit right in with the Holstein cow theme, but maybe the green floor was supposed to be grass or something. It probably was, given that Freddy's red-painted walls had been covered over by murals depicting farmland and meadows filled with wildflowers. Amy flashed back to entering Freddy's when she was a kid. Besides the floor and the stage and the animatronics, the other thing she'd always noticed first was the carnival-like music and bells and jingles of the arcade games. That, and kids screaming and laughing and running all over the place. Flo's had nothing like that. All Amy could hear now was classic country music playing from speakers overhead, and the normal clinks and clatters and chatter of families dining. She did hear a few kids giggling, but she didn't see them. "I know the place is a little cliché," Kim said, "but the food's really good." Amy stiffened and looked at Kim. "What?" Behind her, the restaurant's door opened. She glanced toward it, holding her breath. But it was just an older couple wearing matching pastel jackets, not the police. Kim smiled. "I was telling you the food's good, in spite of how the place looks." She gestured at the lobby. "The owners were farmers before they bought the place, and they're really into cows, their history and such." Amy nodded, her lips pressed together. She wished she could just slip away and poke around, but Kim said, "Follow me." Amy had little choice but to comply. Still on edge, she trailed Kim through the fake gate and on into the packed dining room. Amy was still looking for evidence of the old Freddy's. Maybe the booths? She looked around. No, Flo's did have booths, but they weren't red like the ones in Freddy's. They were brown vinyl made to look like branded leather. The dividers between the booths were different too. They were made of reclaimed barnwood that stretched nearly to the ceiling. Kim led Amy to a booth at the far left side of the dining room in the area that used to be a Freddy's arcade. Amy took a seat and tried to remember what had been this spot 10 years before. Maybe the air hockey table? Or had it been a pinball machine? Amy accepted a menu encased in heavy foul leather from Kim. "Your server will be Mary. She'll be with you in a minute. Enjoy your meal." Amy barely managed a nod and a smile because when Kim had said Mary, a chill had rushed through Amy's body. It was so intense she had to clench her teeth to keep them from chattering. Mary. What were the odds of being served by someone with a name so similar to Mary Jo's? "Probably not that huge," Amy whispered to herself. "It's just a coincidence." "Hi, I'm Mary," a middle-aged woman with dyed spiky red hair and too much makeup said. "How are you doing today?" "Oh, you're not a cow," Amy said. As soon as she said the words, she realized how they'd sounded, and she flushed. Mary barked out a deep, rough laugh. "That depends on who you talk to." She laughed harder. "I'm sorry," Amy said, putting a cool hand to one of her hot cheeks. She really needed to calm herself and focus. "I was referring to the costume, I know." Mary looked down at her Holstein pattern apron, which she wore over black pants and a black blouse. "Servers get away with just this." She gestured at it. When the place first opened, they apparently tried to put the servers in cow costumes too, but being a hostess in that getup is totally different than trying to wait tables in it. They figured that out quick. Amy nodded. "So, what can I get you to drink, sweetie?" Cola? Whatever you have." "One cola coming right up. I'll give you some time to look at the menu." "I also need to use the restroom," Amy said. She didn't, but she wanted a chance to poke around. "I might need a few minutes." "No problem. Thanks." "The restrooms are through that door," Mary said. She pointed toward what used to be the back of the arcade area at Freddy's. "Thanks." As soon as Mary walked away, Amy slipped out of the booth. She still had her bloody, torn sweater on, and she still had her purse slung across her body. She wasn't sure if she actually was going to stay to drink the soda she just ordered. It depended on what she found when she went looking. Standing and checking to see if anyone was watching her, no one was, Amy walked quickly past a back exit from the restaurant, on toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. She idly noticed that a cobweb blew off from a vent at the base of the wall on the left side. Passing its dancing filaments, she entered the hall. Once there, she bypassed the doors marked Ladies and Gents. She didn't think there would be anything to find in new bathrooms, but there was a door marked Maintenance at the back of the hall that was promising. It was in the area where the entrance to the hiding maze used to be. If there was anything left to indicate what had happened to Mary Jo, it would be there. Or, at least, that was Amy's theory. Not that she was too excited about her theory. Ever since she'd entered Flo's fabulous eatery, her enthusiasm for her return to the crime scene plan had waned. A lot. She wasn't sure what she'd been expecting. Obviously, if the restaurant looked totally different on the outside, it would be totally different on the inside, too. Had Amy really thought she was going to find a clue in a place that had been completely and totally remodeled? Just get on with it, Amy told herself. She was here, she might as well poke around. Checking over her shoulder to be sure she was still alone, Amy hurried to the end of the hall and put her hand on the knob of the door marked Maintenance. Would it be locked? She turned the knob. Not locked. The door opened right up. Looking behind her once more, Amy slipped into the dark room and pulled the door closed before she started feeling the wall for a light switch. The room smelled of musty cardboard, bleach, and lemon-scented cleaners, and it felt chilly and damp. The closed door muted the sounds coming from the dining area, so it was nearly silent in the room. The only thing Amy could hear clearly was the sound of her own rapid breathing. After several seconds, Amy still hadn't found the light switch. In those seconds, her imagination had conjured up all sorts of things that could have been sulking in the dark, waiting to leap out at her before she got the light on. After Amy and her parents had moved to their new home, all of Amy's new friends had loved horror movies and ghost stories. In the summer, her parents sent her to camp, and one of her favorite activities there was hanging around a bonfire in the dark listening to scary stories. Amy had hated those stories. To fit in, she'd sat there with her friends, but she'd done her best not to listen. Instead, she'd hummed in her head. When Greta and her other friends dragged her to horror movies, she'd sat with her eyes closed and hummed in her head. She was humming in her head now as she began scrabbling frantically for the light. She'd been in the unlit space long enough. She felt prickles between her shoulder blades, as if her body could sense the spot where a hidden person wanted to plunge a knife. "Where's the light switch?" Amy hissed as she kept pawing at the wall on either side of the door. She was about to give up and go back into the hallway when she heard footsteps entering the hallway outside the door. She froze. Was she about to get caught? Backing away from the door, Amy tried to think of what she'd say if someone found her in here. Nothing besides "I was looking for the restroom" came to mind, and that excuse would only work if she could convince whoever found her that she was blind. Only a person who couldn't see could miss the oversized cow-themed signs to the restrooms. The footsteps in the hallway quieted, then stopped. The person must have gone into one of the restrooms. Amy exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She stepped back to the door, which she could locate because of the light coming in underneath it. She realized her eyes were adjusting to the dark, whereas the room had seemed to be nothing but solid inky blackness moments before. Now she could discern hulking shapes on either side of the door. She could also see what appeared to be a cord dangling down next to the door's trim. She reached out and pulled on it, hoping she wasn't yanking on something that would set off an alarm. As soon as Amy pulled the cord, the room was flooded with bright white light from a bank of fluorescent bulbs overhead. She immediately whirled in a circle to be sure that she'd imagined sharing the space with someone else. She had. She was alone. The small room looked to be a combination of janitor's closet and storage closet. It had the same green flooring as the rest of the restaurant, and the walls were painted sky blue. A bucket and a mop sat in one corner, along with several brooms and dusters. Next to these, a shelf of cleaning supplies extended from the floor to the low ceiling. Next to that, another shelf full of paper products, paper towels, napkins, toilet paper, extended to the back wall. Amy looked at that far wall. It was partially obscured by a stack of boxes, but over the top of the boxes, Amy could see what looked like the upper edge of a dusty vent cover. And above the vent cover, she thought she saw some faded orange and red paint. Was that part of the rainbow? Her heart stuttered in her chest. Could it be? Was the hiding maze really still here? Amy quickly stepped forward and tried to shove aside the stack of boxes. It was too heavy to shove. Frowning, she pushed at the top box, which was above her head. It wasn't too heavy on its own, so she lifted it up and set it aside. The one below it was even lighter. She moved it, too. She shifted one more box, leaving the two bottom ones. Now that she'd moved the top boxes, she could see that she'd definitely found the entrance to the hiding maze game. The grate was dirty, and it looked a little rusty, but it was the right size and shape, and it was surrounded by the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet of the old rainbow. Amy was surprised that the new owners had left the grate and the rainbow. But then, the rainbow fit with the countryside theme of the place. They must have figured it went with the sky blue paint. Or maybe they'd kept it as some kind of homage to the old pizzeria. She learned from watching her parents redo two old houses that if you didn't have to fix something, it saved money to leave it. Why move an old grate and paint over a rainbow in what was going to be a storage room? The bottom two boxes were the heaviest ones, but now that she'd moved the others, Amy could shove aside the remaining ones. She pushed them just far enough to clear a path. Stepping up to the grate, Amy grabbed its edge and pulled. It didn't move. She frowned. It hadn't been nailed shut or anything, had it? She ran her fingers around the edges of the grate. No, it didn't feel like anything was holding it closed. The sound of footsteps came from the hall again. They sounded different from the last footfalls Amy had heard. They were heavier, slower, but they were coming closer. Not willing to be caught now that she was so close to being able to investigate what she came here to see, Amy quickly pulled back the boxes that had been blocking the grate. Positioning them just far enough from the grate to give her room to maneuver, but close to where they had been that she'd come in here, she hustled to restack the other three boxes. She just put the last one on top when the door to the room opened. Tucked behind the stack she'd just rebuilt in the nick of time, Amy held her breath, this time on purpose. She listened as someone stomped into the room. She heard a soft shuffling sound and a heavy sigh, and then someone muttered, "And they yell at me for leaving the light on. Why should I turn it off if no one else will?" More footsteps, moving away. The door closed. Amy took a deep breath and turned back to the grate. Maybe the rust in the grate was acting as a glue, holding the grate tight to the wall. Amy frowned and tried tugging again. She needed to hurry. She wasn't sure how long she'd been back here. 2 minutes? 5 minutes? More than that? How long would it take before someone came looking for her? Amy could feel tension pulling up her shoulders. Her neck felt stiff. She stepped back from the grate and rolled her head in a circle. That brought a little clarity. "Dummy," she said as she zipped open her purse. Reaching into the small pouch, she pulled out a metal nail file. She might not have carried much in her purse, but she had the essentials. She poked the end of the nail file between the wall and the rusty edge of the grate, and she worked it back and forth along the top and bottom of the side. After just a minute or so, she felt something give. Encouraged, she ran the file farther down the edge of the vent, continuing to jiggle the grate with her other hand. It took several seconds, but suddenly the grate came away from the wall. Amy pulled it back fully. Holding it open, she ducked down to peer in through the opening. The storage room's bright light landed on what Amy had been hoping she'd find, the entrance room to the hiding maze game. It was still here. Stretching out from the vent opening, the game tunnel disappeared into gloom, but the part Amy could see was lined with fake trees and boulders and little wood cubbyhole doors. The doors looked like they were fuzzy with dust, as was the tunnel floor, but everything appeared to be intact. It was obvious no one had been in the tunnel in years. A lot of years. 10 years, to be exact. Okay, I'm gonna pause right there and say, this is giving me real Silver Eyes vibes, okay? Freddy, Fazbear's Pizza, covered up by a new building. In Silver Eyes, it was a mall. Here, it's this cow what is it, Flo's something, diner thing. And then, 10 years after a big incident, just like in the Silver Eyes, our main character comes back to Freddy's, finds it in this old building still. At least it's part of Freddy's in this story. And I'm assuming we're going to find something pretty crazy. So, definitely Silver Eyes vibes that I'm getting here. I will say that. It wasn't just the thick dust that made it clear this place hadn't been seen in a while. Just a few feet inside the tunnel, the same sock Amy had seen the last time she'd been here lay crumpled. It had to be the same sock because it had a distinctive multicolored stripe and a hole in the toe. Amy looked beyond the sock and spotted all the other debris she remembered from her last time in the game. As if you remember all that. The deflated balloon, the piles of confetti, and the broken red plastic fork. Amy felt her pulse tighten. Maybe no one had been in the game since it was last played. If that was so, she actually had a good chance of finding the clue she was looking for. Amy dropped down onto her hands and knees and crawled into the game entrance room. As soon as she was in it, the vent cover dropped into place behind her. Immediately, Amy noticed that the dining room sounds were even more muffled. She could barely hear anything at all from the restaurant's eating area. No one can hear you scream. Just the occasional laughter, which sounded like it was miles away. She suddenly felt very, very alone. Calm down, she told herself. She turned around and sat cross-legged in front of the console. Whenever she'd used the console as a kid, it always lit up. Now it was dark. Dark and dirty. It was covered with dust. Amy reached out and pressed a button at random, hoping it would light up if she did. For a few seconds, the console stayed dormant. But then, suddenly, the old Freddy voice Amy remembered said, "Welcome to Freddy's Maze Hide-and-Seek game. Please wait, a game is currently in progress." Oh, the same game's still going, huh? 10 years. Amy turned away from the console. She started crawling down the tunnel. As soon as Amy started moving, dust wafted up around her. She sneezed, and her eyes started to itch. Resisting the urge to rub them, she kept going. The old tree bark, hanging branches, and moss crumbled around her as they hit her. They were brittle with age. Amy was thankful that whoever had come into the maintenance closet had defied the rules and left the light on. The light was strong enough to illuminate most of the main tunnel. She could even see traces of the old chocolate frosting stains on one of the boulders. She wasn't sure how well she was going to see after she turned off the main tunnel, but Amy wasn't too concerned about that. If she had to go back to the restaurant, eat a meal, leave to get a flashlight, and come back later, she would, as long as she could avoid being spotted by the police. But she couldn't leave now without at least doing an initial search for some sign of what happened to Mary Jo. Amy took her time crawling down the tunnel because she was scrutinizing every inch of it. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Signs of a struggle? Blood? A plea for help scratched into the tunnel walls? She'd thought about those kinds of things whenever she thought about coming to look back for Mary Jo. There had to be something. Tucker must have left behind something to prove he'd gotten into the game to take Mary Jo. At the end of the first leg of the tunnel, where she'd be out of light if she kept going to the right or left, Amy glanced at the other game console. This one was dusty too, but it wasn't totally dark. Instead of a blank display like the one the entrance had, this one could be read. Amy peered at it. What was that? She crawled closer and rubbed her finger over the console's name display. She gasped. The breathy sound bounced around her, then faded as she stared at the display. The console panel still listed her and Mary Jo as the active players. They were the last ones to play the game? She hadn't known that. Hoping that the game console and tunnel lights would come on, Amy hit the reset button on the console. It worked! The console's display lit up. It was flashing failure, but so what? What happened was the rope lights that lined the tunnels and surrounded the cubbyhole doors lit up. Amy grinned. Yes! This would make her investigation easier. She started to turn away from the console so she could get on with it. The rainforest soundtrack started playing, and Amy shivered. Hearing the old rain sounds and screeches creeped her out. She shook herself like a dog. She was being silly. The way I imagine those sounds is I imagine them being like the ambience noise from Do You Copy? That game. That's what I'm thinking of when she mentions this like rainforest noise. I don't know if you can find it on YouTube, but the background sounds in that game. That's what this reminds me of. She shook herself like a dog. She was being silly. Amy crawled away from the console and started to pass a closed cubbyhole. As she did, the slithery edges of a dark and horrifying suspicion started creeping into her consciousness. She pulled her head out of the cubbyhole and looked back at the game console, which was still flashing failure. Amy plummeted from the sunny heights of the exultation she'd felt moments before into a low, slimy bog of dread. She turned and looked left and right down the tunnels that extended from the entry tunnel. Her gaze flitted frantically from one cubbyhole door to the next. Her head pounding, Amy turned right out of the main tunnel and started crawling faster, her gaze flitting frantically around her as she went. In spite of the chill in the tunnels, Amy was sweating. She was also breathing hard. Her inhales and exhales were so loud that they echoed off the walls of the crawl spaces. It sounded like a pack of panting dogs was pursuing her. After just a few minutes of crawling at a breakneck pace up and down through the tunnels and this way and that through the game's nooks and crannies, Amy's knees began to protest what she was doing. Not used to repeated impacts on a hard surface, they began to pulse with burning pain. Her neck ached, too, because of the strained position she was keeping it in to look into each cubbyhole. Okay, I'm going to stop this one more time, because I do have a prediction to make, and then we'll keep going, and I won't keep interrupting. I think what is going to happen is, I have a feeling, because when they agreed to play this game, they said if it takes her longer than 3 minutes, they'll stay at Freddy's, and if it's less than 3 minutes, they'll go do something else. They'll leave Freddy's, because Amy didn't want to be at Freddy's. I think, since it's been longer than 3 minutes, Amy's gonna die too, and then, it took her longer than 3 minutes to find her, so now they're staying at Freddy's forever, because they're dead. That's what I think is gonna happen. And it's kind of like calling back to the deal they made at the start. Because it's definitely been longer than 3 minutes. It's been 10 years, so I'd say they should stay at Freddy's for forever. I don't know. We'll see if that's what happens. That's my prediction. Amy was circling back to the point where the first leg of the main tunnel intersected with the main passageways to the left and to the right. She glanced into an open cubbyhole, and she did a double take. Was that... Amy frowned and peered into the cubbyhole. She'd seen a flash of something red toward the back of the cubbyhole. Crawling in through the open door, Amy reached for what she'd just seen. She couldn't quite grasp it, so she crawled the rest of the way into the cubbyhole just as her fingers closed over her lost friendship bracelet. Wow, how weird was that? Suddenly, Amy's cubbyhole door swished shut, snapping into place. The tiny space went dim, lit only by the rope lights outside the cubbyhole. Their illumination just made it through the tiny window on the cubbyhole door. "Hey!" Amy shouted. She twisted around so she could get the door open again. She whacked her head on the cubbyhole's wall. Ow! Reaching out, Amy tried to push the cubbyhole door open. It wouldn't open. Outside the cubbyhole, Freddy announced, "Player 2 has chosen a hiding spot. Player 1, find Player 2. Go!" "No, no, no," Amy shouted. Amy pounded on the door, but it still didn't open. Gulping in ragged breaths, Amy shifted to shove her shoulder against the door. As she did, her face pressed up against the viewing window. She looked out at the open door to the cubbyhole across from hers. Not much light fell into the cubbyhole from the rope lights, but the light that did make it revealed... Amy's breath caught, and then it released, along with a scream that contained every single particle of guilt she'd carried for the last 10 years. She now knew what happened to Mary Jo.
But first, this video is sponsored by the Elementia Studios Patreon. If you feel like supporting the channel for only $1 a month, check it out. The link will be in the description.
"Player 1, find Player 2, Freddy's voice ordered. Sealed inside a cubbyhole for 10 long years, Mary Jo's desiccated corpse had practically mummified. Okay, so what, she just got stuck in the cubbyhole and that's what happened to her? Curled inward, drawn down probably by the dried-up skin, Mary Jo's body was embracing her backpack, which she held it like a baby. Had it given her any comfort? It didn't look like it had. The skin drawn tight against her bones, Mary Jo's face was brown and leathery, frozen in what looked at first to be a rigid smile. Mary Jo's lips were gone and her mouth was pulled back from her big teeth. Whimpering, Amy understood, of course, that Mary Jo hadn't been smiling when she died. She'd probably been screaming, crying out for someone to hear her, to find her. Amy frantically shifted positions and kicked out at the door with both feet. It didn't do any good. She didn't have the room to pull her feet back far enough to get any power behind the kick. They just thumped the door ineffectually. Outside the cubbyhole, Freddy nudged, "Player 1, find Player 2. Amy pounded on her cubbyhole door again. She kicked at it over and over. She threw herself at it. It didn't budge. Clearly the game wasn't functioning right. The doors weren't going to open. Amy's heart crawled up into her throat. She began to hyperventilate, and she started begging, "Please, no!" Once again, she pressed her face up to the little window as if she could look for help. Nothing but Mary Jo's silent corpse looked back at her. Amy threw herself at the door. It remained closed. She started scratching at the edges of it. She dug at the rubber seal, trying to gouge it out. Crying and wincing as her nails broke off, Amy clawed and clawed, but the rubber seal remained impervious to her attack. It didn't even leave a mark on it. Amy sagged against the door. Sour-smelling sweat ran down her neck and trickled along her spine. Surely someone would hear her eventually, wouldn't they? They didn't hear Mary Jo, she thought. Amy began to tremble, and she forced herself to remain calm. It was going to be okay. She wasn't like Mary Jo. People cared about her. Her parents would come looking for her. Her friends would look for her. Her car was in the restaurant parking lot. Kim would remember her. Mary would remember that Amy had asked where the restrooms were. They'd know she was in here. But would they? Really? No one knew the hiding maze was back here. Why would anyone look in an old crawl space for a missing woman? Okay, this is now giving me 1:35 a.m. vibes. Maybe they'd see the grate and find player 2, Freddy's voice intoned. Amy lost all semblance of calm and gave way to panic. She started wailing, and then she shrieked. She shrieked until her throat burned and spasmed, and then she swallowed and she screamed some more. Amy screamed until her lungs forced her to stop and fill them. Then she started crying. She sobbed at first, and then, thinking about her abandoned friend, she wailed. Mary Jo had died the same way she'd lived, Amy realized. She'd died because no one had cared enough about her to do what was necessary to take care of her. Find player 2, Freddy's voice repeated. Amy pounded on the door of the cubbyhole and screamed at the top of her lungs. Doesn't she have a phone with her? Pretty sure she had a phone with her. Mary approached the nice young woman's booth and frowned at the soda sitting on the table next to the unopened menu. The soda clearly hadn't been touched. It was no longer fizzing, and at least half the ice had melted. A ring of condensation was pooling on the table's slick wood surface. No one stayed in that restroom that long. The woman must have left. Mary glanced up and saw Kim heading her way with an elderly couple in tow. Shrugging, Mary picked up the abandoned soda and menu, quickly wiped the table, and pointed at it. You can seat them here, Kim. My last customer took off, I guess. Kim smiled, nodded, and helped the customers get settled in the booth. As soon as Kim left, Mary grinned at her new customers. Hi, I'm Mary, she said. How are you doing today? From the vent near the hallway, leading to the restrooms, an ever-so-faint scream reached out into the dining room. Its echo lingered for a couple seconds, but the sound was inconsequential. It didn't stand a chance of being heard. Wow, okay. I will cautiously say that I liked that one. I think that I can see some people who would say, oh, it's another story that isn't very related to Freddy's, and that's what I've been saying about a lot of these stories. It is, though. Sure, it just kind of has Freddy's in it, and then this hiding maze inside of it, but I think that what it really nails is the tone of Freddy's. This tone of, like, going back to, like forgotten places and stuff, which is kind of what the Silver Eyes kind of felt like to me, like going back to this place that everyone's forgotten, you know, and seeing what's there, and that's like really intriguing to me. And I think that this kind of nails that same tone very well, which is also kind of like this tone that Sister Location gave me, and I really like that. I think that there's definitely some parallels here, whether they mean anything or not. You'd think the last story would have a bit more lore implications. This one seemed like it would, with like a serial killer and everything, but then it turns out that was a complete red herring, so I guess whatever. Maybe not. I would have liked a bit more obvious lore relevance. I don't even know if there is anything here, if it's just a one big red herring. I will say for what it was, as a standalone story, this was good. The book as a whole, I think, wasn't that fantastic. This one, I think, kind of saved it from being like one of the worst. This one was pretty good, and I definitely rate it fairly high in my personal ranking, which I will, I guess, have to do soon. Yeah, overall, a pretty solid story, less solid book. This and the epilogue, I think, kind of saved it from being just mediocre. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of the end until Felix the Shark comes out in a month. So we'll get to that too, which apparently I thought it was just kind of scrapped stories, and it is, but like they're full stories that they just kind of finished, I guess. It seems like full stories, so I guess I'll read that like I would any of these other books, because it seems to be similar, and they actually seem to have more interesting stories than the rest of these, so don't know how that works. Like, there's one about a Freddy mask, like from FNAF 2, which would have easily taken over Kids at Play any day of the week. So I'm not sure how that happened, but that might end up being one of my favorite books of the series, honestly, with the scrapped stories. So don't know what that says, but yeah. I'll do some stuff on the graphic novels when those come out, and yeah, those I think will be interesting. We'll see if they're any good. And Tales from the Pizzaplex, which could be good. I don't know, we'll see. I'm not so sure what to think about that yet. The series is kind of in a weird place right now. Security Breach might save it, but I don't know. I'm feeling kind of weird on the series right now. We'll see if those books are any good, and Security Breach, I think, probably will be. I don't want to get my hopes too high up. I don't want to be disappointed by the game, but I think it's going to be pretty good. So we'll see. Thank you guys for listening. We will get to that soon, I guess. Felix the Shark in a month, or almost half a month at this point, I guess. All right, see you then. Bye-bye.